Who? Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We want to make sure that we stay on schedule so we have time before the class this evening. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Rebecca Kariuki to all of you. Many of you I know have met her, know her, have worked with her over the last year and a half. I just want to emphasize a couple things. This is really exciting for us. We have someone that's really doing the interdisciplinary work that we talk about, somebody that's spanning the natural sciences and social sciences, doing really cool work in land use, land cover change, spatial analysis, and so on, but then linking that with participatory workshops and other approaches like that that bring in the bottom-up work from the social science side as well. Rebecca has her bachelor's and master's from the University of Nairobi. From a biological perspective, looking at biology and conservation, zoology, and so on. Her PhD was at the University of York in the UK. Let me see, I think this summarizes the kind of interdisciplinary approach we're looking at. Her PhD was titled Interactions Between Climate, Vegetation, and People. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Rebecca and look forward to seeing what you have to say. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Mike, and thanks all of you for making time to attend the job talk. So I'll get into the job talk. So I'll talk about land use and land cover change features in East Africa's rangelands. And throughout the presentation, I will use LULCC to just represent land use and land cover change. But before I get into my presentation, I'd like to talk a bit about myself, which Mike has talked a bit briefly. So my academic journey pretty much began at the University of Nairobi, where I did an undergraduate degree in chemistry and zoology. And then that led me to do a master's degree in conservation biology. Following that, I went to the UK and worked with the environment department. I did a master's degree, a PhD degree in environmental geography, which then led me to do like my postdoc at the Nelson Mandela African Institute of Science and Technology in Arusha, Tanzania, where I did a postdoc, which then led me here at the School of Sustainability, where I'm doing another postdoc. And then in terms of my research interest, pretty much what I do, I look at land use, I look at environmental change through the lens of land use. And so I look at what are the causes and the consequences of land use and land cover change in dry areas in Africa. And then I also look at what are some of the trajectories towards the future and what does that mean for food production, conservation, and also for development. And then in terms of the approaches that I tend to use, so pretty much like Mike said, I'm pretty much like an interdisciplinary researcher, where I use perspective from the social sciences, mainly from stakeholder engagement workshops and surveys and interviews, and also ecological perspectives like on plant composition and structure. And then also like I do some modeling, which could be agent-based modeling or spatial modeling. All this is done pretty much to like understand to understand land use and land cover change impacts on societies and biodiversity. And so now I get to my research, which is focused on rangelands. So rangelands are pretty much like areas which have natural vegetation and semi-natural vegetation, and they're mainly used for grazing. They're quite expansive across the world as they occupy at least 50% of the Earth's surface, and they support at least 2 billion people and a significant amount of livestock and wildlife. However, that being said, they're also threatened by sustainable land uses, which pretty much involve like land use that converts the land cover which fragments the ecosystem and causes degradation. And then besides that, they also face climate change. And then also, despite their significance and their like vastness, there are limited assessments of rangeland sustainability. And then coming to Africa, so rangelands occupy at least 60% of the land area, and 35% is under permanent pasture, which is pretty much used by wildlife, which sometimes is found together with livestock in the same area, like is shown in this picture. Sorry. like here. And then in some areas, you actually find like the livestock and the wildlife, they're separate. And then within Africa, one of my research areas is in East Africa. And this is an interesting area because it's rich in biodiversity. And because of the richness in biodiversity, you have a lot of area which is set aside for conservation. And these are areas which are called protected areas. So they're predominantly used as for protecting wildlife. And they're all colored here in these maps. So the different colors pretty much shows the level of protection or what animals are allowed. Like where you have this light green, you actually find these are areas which are just for wildlife alone. Whereas when you find these other areas, you actually find like livestock and wildlife, they live together. And the kind of livestock systems that are found in these areas, they are pastoral livestock systems. This pretty much involves where you have pastoralists who are herders, they move with animals from one place to the other. And so all these areas, which are different colors, these are like different land sharing systems between livestock and wildlife. And then within East Africa, my work is centered there. That's the Kenya-Tanzania borderland region. So you have Kenya here, this is Uganda, and then this is Tanzania. So this is the area. And why the Kenya-Tanzania borderland region? So this is an interesting area. It's dry. So you have like the areas here on this side are drier than this. So getting an average rainfall of about 350 to 1,000 millimeters. And then also most of the people are supported by land-based livelihoods. So most people depend on land for their livelihoods. And also this area is also rich in biodiversity. And because of that, you see a lot of it is protected. These areas are shown in green color. But what the Kenya-Tanzania borderland region is really known for is the wild-based migration. And so I'm going to play a short video that was sent to me by a friend taken last month just to show you why the wild-based migration looks like in reality and why it matters. So every year you find at least 1 million wild-beast and about 500,000 zebras and antelopes moving from Tanzania going all the way to Kenya and from Kenya going all the way to Tanzania. And they do this when they're following the vegetation availability, which again follows the rainfall pattern. And besides all these high numbers of wildlife, you also find a lot of livestock for the livestock herders. And because of the high numbers of wildlife, so these are just wild beasts alone. So you haven't seen the zebras and the antelope. So you have this, and then you have the cattle. And this makes the ecosystem one of the ecosystems across the world that has the highest biomass of animals.
Oh, I see him, oh my God.
That is the better little one. You can see how they jump. Oh, look, it's falling down.
I'm on the top.
Look.
It's coming out the left side.
Yeah.
Right. It's like you see a dark thing floating in the water slowly.
So besides that, this ecosystem has like high wildlife and livestock biomass, which again form a significant contribution to the GDP of these two countries. There's a significant challenge that is facing this ecosystem. And that's land use and land cover change. And what I mean by that is the conversion of natural vegetation, which are dominant again in the rangelands, to either croplands, which again happen to sustain the growing population. So that's very much needed. And then there's also the conversion of natural vegetation to firewood, because most people again depend on land. And then there's also conversion of natural vegetation. These are wildlife species and they're also being used by herders. There's conversion of natural vegetation to the towns and the settlements, again, to meet the demands of growing population, which are very much needed. But what are the impacts of all this conversion? So when you look at the map in reality, just to understand the impact of that, you actually see this being Kenya here, and this being Tanzania, and then this being the line here. And then when you look at the colors, what they show is that where you have green, or brown or yellow, that's natural vegetation. And where you have pink, this conspicuous pink color is agriculture. And when you look at this part here, this is Tanzania, you see the pink color coming all the way until where it meets the black line, which is the boundary of a protected area. So it just shows that if that boundary was not there, probably that area would actually be under cropland. And these are wildlife spaces. And the same thing in other areas like here, you actually see the pink color coming into the protected areas, which are shown by this boundary. This is Mount Kilimanjaro, the highest mountain in the continent. And you see agriculture coming into the slopes of the mountain. So that's very common there. And so that's the reality on a land cover map. That is actually what you see. And then moving forward, besides land use and land cover change being a threat, there's also the climate change impact. And what has been manifested in the term in climate change impact is that this area has been encountering a lot of extreme droughts, which the frequency has increased. And that means there's reduced food for animals, which have to migrate further. And then you also find there's also reduced shelter. The heat can be too much for the animals. And so they also affected. And then when you look at climate change, it just doesn't affect the wildlife. It also affects the livestock, which are also dominant in this area. So there's also reduced food. And what then that means is that there's a lot of degradation because the only available food is shared between the animals. And then the rivers are also dry because of the extreme drought. So meaning the animals have to move further to look for water where they can find. And then this means there's a lot more contact between people and wildlife, which creates, again, more degradation and sometimes conflict. So having that background in mind, then my work is interested in understanding what are the drivers and the consequences of land use change in this area. And so specifically, what I was interested in this paper that I'm presenting is that I wanted to understand how do pastoralists decide how to use their land in southern Kenya? And then how do the pastoral land use decision vary across different rainfall years and land tenure scenarios? And then what is the impact of these land use changes on livestock and wildlife and the pastoralist income in this area? And all this with an intention of understanding how pastoralist land use decision impact livestock and wildlife numbers and also pastoralist income. So that's the main idea behind how I worked this paper. And so you might ask why climate change and land tenure. So we did a survey and we asked the pastoralists, what are some of the biggest things that drive your land use decisions? And so they gave a list of things, and climate change and land tenure were the two most important things. So we've already seen the impact of climate change, but the impact of land tenure is mainly through either it's communal land or private land or government land, and that affects the access to resources. And so generally where there's communal land, there's collective action and people can, the access to resources is not limited and the pastoralists can access all sorts of mainly grazing resources. But where there's private land, there are things like fences and the vegetation inside and outside the fences change. And there's also all this restriction of accessing resources. And so to answer the question of how pastoralist land use decision affect livestock numbers and wildlife numbers, and the pastoralist well-being, I sort of like combined two models. So a dynamic global vegetation model, which I've abbreviated as DGVM, and an agent-based model. And so the idea behind this modeling work was pretty much like to simulate plant biomass in that area that I was working with, which then was used in an agent-based model that pretty much had a lot of social economic variables. Some were fixed, some were dynamic, and then having that put some rules in the model and then just to get an idea of or output on what are the wildlife densities, what will be the livestock densities, and what will be the income that pastoralists can get under different scenarios. And so from this work, we saw that in the absence of conservation subsidies, these are pretty much like money that is given to pastoralists to allow pastoralists to use their land, to allow pastoralists to use their land and allow wildlife to come and graze on the land. So when that is not provided, you actually see like under different tenure here, you see that livestock grazing, the green color, is the dominant land use in both communal and government land. However, and you also see that here in private land, you actually see that the green color is not as dominant as the red, and agriculture is practiced in private land. And then on the other hand, if pastoralists are given conservation subsidies, there's an interesting land use that comes out, and it's the brown color. So the conservation as a land use becomes dominant in the area. So pastoralists are willing to allow wildlife to use their land. But that just happens in the communal land and the government land. But when you look at the private land, most people, when it's a dry year, that's only when the brown color comes in. Ideally, when it's a dry year, that is when people with private land are willing to allow conservation in their area. Otherwise, when it's a wet year, they're willing to practice agriculture. And it's because agriculture brings in more money than conservation. And then in terms of impact on this, what we can actually see is that generally where there's conservation land, which is green here, you actually find there are a lot more animals where the land is communal as compared to where the land is in private land. And so from this work, it's able to show the impact of climate change and land tenure in driving animals across the Kenya-Tanzania borderland region. Then moving on, so what does this, the next thing that I did was now to understand, so this is what has been happening in the area, so what might the future look like for this area, and how might that affect the animals, which require a lot of space, and also the communities that depend on land. And so for me to answer that, so I started like doing a future work, just trying to see how this land might change into the future. And so the idea was now to look at this current land cover that we have already seen, and just having and knowing that agriculture is expanding into protected areas and it's reducing space for animals, and also there's the aspect of climate change affecting the area. And so for this work, I wanted to understand this is the current land cover. How might that change in the future? There's no one singular feature. There are many features because it's characterized by uncertainty, and it's also very unpredictable. And then when that changes in the future, how will that affect the sustainability of the Kenya-Tanzania borderland region? And so to answer this, I integrated stakeholder perspectives with spatial modeling. And I will explain how I did it. And I did it with a methodology called Kesho. So Kesho is a Swahili word meaning tomorrow. And it was developed by Kapitani et al. In 2016. And what it does, it sort of like integrates stakeholder perspectives with quantitative spatial modeling. So with an idea of producing like qualitative and semi-quantitative and spatial outputs to show where land is going to change in the future. And so I will play a short video just to show you how it actually works in reality and the rationale behind that.
The world faces many challenges, such as changing climate, unsustainable infrastructure, loss of biodiversity, and food insecurity. These challenges are acutely felt across Africa. Often we react to these challenges only after they have had an impact and unintended consequences, such as following the construction of a new railway, road, or development corridor. At this time, it is too late and costly to mitigate or hard to adapt. We must find a better way. Researchers, practitioners, and communities are working together to get ahead of these problems by exploring the future of social, ecological, economic systems through the lens of land use. They use a participatory tool called Kesho to understand what landscapes will look like in the near and far future, focusing on 2030 and 2063 to align with the Sustainable Development Goals and the African Union 2063 Development Agenda. Kesho is a participatory scenario approach that was developed with the specific objective of integrating local perspectives from a range of stakeholders combined with semi-quantitative land use modelling. The process starts by understanding the historical transformations that have impacted on the present. Using this context, we set present-day boundary conditions as to what the land use is and how this could change in the future as climates change, Populations grow, demands and policies change. Collectively, we co-produce narrative storylines of change, analyze and consolidate the scenarios, and validate the outputs with stakeholders. Kesho is a versatile tool that has proven to be effective in addressing complex sustainability issues, from local management up to wider policy decisions. In Kenya, Kesho has been used to analyze the interconnections between basic human well-being, environmental factors, and linear transport infrastructure from the coast to Lake Victoria. In Tanzania, Kesho has been used to explore trajectories of green growth, conservation, and climate-smart agriculture in rice, sugarcane, and teak plantations.
So I'll talk about how I applied Kesho in Tanzania, and especially on the Kenya-Tanzania borderland region. And so in the Tanzanian side of the Kenya-Tanzania borderland region, together with colleagues, we engaged stakeholders, diverse stakeholders who had some interest and interest in land use and land cover change. These were comprised of like geologists, environmental scientists, social scientists, the community, and land use engineer, civil engineers, this like road engineers. And so the idea was like to bring all these people together in a 3-day workshop and sort of like to look at what has been happening in the area, what has been the drivers of change, and what has been the consequences of that. And so tapping into that, and so like creating scenarios of the future based on the understanding of the area and what has been happening in the area. And so there were several activities at the workshop, but the idea of creating, understanding what has been ongoing and using those insights to get into the future made them create like a timeline, which pretty much like had all the main events that led to land use and land cover change in the area, like in the past. And for this particular workshop, they created a timeline from 1920 to 2020 when the workshop was held. And they created and they developed, they populated the timeline with all sorts of factors, from social factors to economic factors, political factors. And then based on this insight, they developed the scenarios, and the process of developing a scenario pretty much involved them like looking into the future. In this case, the scenarios, the time horizon was 2063, and then sort of like identifying what will be the key drivers of land use and land cover change in the future, ranking the drivers, and then creating a 2x2 matrix, which and then populating the 2x2 matrix, which the 4 boxes sort of like make each scenario. So you have like 4 scenarios. And then the next thing was now for me to get into all these narratives and combine that with secondary data, spatial data for the most part, and things like census data, and to create maps which fill in the 4 boxes and sort of like reflect the narratives of the stakeholders. And so for this, for the southwestern part of Serengeti, which is one of the areas where I had a workshop, it sort of like created this matrix. And what it says is that in the future, according to the stakeholders, they pretty much like saw population growth here, and agricultural economy will be the main drivers of land use and land cover change. And then they created like 4 scenarios. They gave them Swahili names. So there was like this one, scenario 1, which I've labeled S1. It means how will we recover, and it will be characterized by high population growth and sustainable practices of agricultural economy. And so for each of these boxes, they populated it. And so you see like this one will have like human activities will encroach the protected areas, while this one, the human activities will not encroach the protected areas. And then from these narratives, then the next thing I did was to look at this map, which we have seen before. It's one portion of that map with a lot of pink, and sort of like look at this, how will it change in the 4 boxes based on those narratives that the stakeholders have given, and also based on what data like land demand for the future in the area looks like, or what are the suitability for land in the area. And so that involved spatial modeling, which I did in R and ArcMap. And then I came up with these scenarios here. And so what these ones mean is that, so you have this land cover in 2019, and then moving on to 2063 when the scenarios were made. And so this under a scenario where the population is high and the agricultural practices are unsustainable, we have encroachment into the boundaries of protected areas. And we also have the built up area coming up, and it's shown by pink dots. It's probably not very, very visible from where you can see, but it's, and then when you compare that with an area, with a scenario where the population growth is high, but the sustainable practices, you find that there's agriculture increases, but it doesn't encroach the protected areas. Whereas on the other hand, a scenario which has unsustainable practices and low population, you have a lot of natural vegetation getting lost. And then the other scenario, which has low population and sustainable practices, you have a lot of vegetation, natural vegetation being present into the future. And so these scenario results, we took them back to the stakeholders who sort of like developed the scenario narratives. And the idea behind this was pretty much for the stakeholders to look at the results and say whether A, it's a reflection of what the stories were before, and B, if they're sensible. And so this process was pretty much like iterative, because until we had some consensus, that's when this process was complete. And then, so all this work was done at the Kenya-Tanzania borderland region. And so what do these insights from this area mean, like for my future work, for my work? How did I grow this? And so from this work, other aspects besides the scenarios that we got, this work was able to show the value of using academia for society. Because number one, through this work, we were able to engage at least 100 stakeholders who represented different organizations. And some of the stakeholders actually took the methodology, and there's actually like one person who went ahead and used the whole scenario planning methodology to help people in their area to develop things like village land use plans. Also, the process also showed the aspect of social learning, because the diverse stakeholders were able to work together and come up with solutions and collectively address the challenge of land use and land cover change in their area. They learn from each other, they network from each other. And then also, it also provided a platform for some of the marginalized voices, because we're able to work with pastoralists who are not engaged in these conversations, and we're able to capture their voice, and they are also and include them in the scenario narratives, and also when creating the maps, they're also able to work with the government officers who came to the workshop, and we communicated together. And then besides that, I also applied for funding and got that from the International Development Research Center in Canada and the government of Canada, where I applied to do the same methodology in Namibia. And Namibia is an interesting country because it's a driest country in sub-Saharan Africa. It's also rich in biodiversity, as shown in all these shaded areas. It's also known for its pro-conservation policies, which are seemed as more successful than those that happen in East Africa. And it's also densely populated with people of about 3.8, I think, people per square kilometers. And it was interesting to just see how do people, or how might the land use and land cover change features in this area look like in the future. And so what comes in from this work in Namibia is pretty much like what is different from what is happening, is expected to happen in East Africa, is that in the future, Namibia is expected to the growth of wildlife economy is expected to drive the land use and land cover change features there, as opposed to East Africa, only because it's more developed there and they allow consumptive use of resources. And then we also have issues like the policy, which are pro-conservation, pretty much like being key drivers of land use, as opposed to East Africa, where most policies are there, but they're not really followed. And then also through this work, it also shows how you can actually apply this futures thinking and understand to see how it's linked to global sustainability priorities. Only because this work, the time horizons for this work were pretty much like aligned to some to agendas, which and we're trying to match what the land use and land cover change might mean to meet some of these sustainable development goals. And so it just shows the importance of like local scale work and how you can actually use that to sort of like amplify, to sort of like align that and see if you can be able to address some of the priorities for the future. And then also from this work, we've also grown some bit of work into that and going ahead and seeing how can we use local scale impact and seeing how much they're aligned to global priorities. And for that, we have been working on work that tries to understand how local conservation actions in sub-Saharan Africa match the global conservation priorities. And from the earlier insights that we're actually getting, we are seeing that local scale conservation action in managing wildlife resources in most places in Africa is not integrated in national plans that implement global plans. So all this came out from all these local scale studies that we have been doing. And so using all these insights, we can be able to now get back to our work and just seeing the value of place-based social ecological research for global sustainability, and also to address some of the limited assessments that are there in these rangelands. And hopefully we could be able, through studies of this land use and land cover change, you can be able to address all these unsustainable land use practices that have been affecting the rangelands. So what are the next steps? So my research so far has been interested in assessments of the drivers and consequences of ongoing land use and land cover change in East Africa. And also like looking at what then that means for food production and natural and conservation in the future. So moving into the future here at Source, I see myself continue setting up a lab in the next 1 year. And then also like growing these insights, which have so far looked at the impacts of land use and land cover change, and trying to be very targeted and look and being specific on what the consequences I'll be looking at. And so for that, I'm seeing myself looking at specific impacts of land use and land cover change on ecosystem services such as habitat quality, water yields, and looking for funding from organizations like the USAID. I also see myself growing as a researcher who's interested in nature-based solutions, in addressing such challenges that are facing the areas that I'm working with, such as challenges such as habitat fragmentation or climate change and land degradation. And then I also see myself as expanding my research and looking at land use systems, not only like in the dry areas that I've been working with in Africa, but also growing to other areas in the US, which are dry, for instance, here in Arizona, and also other areas, and applying for fundings from USDA or even here at ASU or USGS. And also I'm seeing myself also like working with diverse teams here at ASU and trying to strengthen the methodologies that I've been using, in particular like methodologies that link participatory approaches with spatial modeling. So that's something I would want to do and work together with researchers in that area. And then in terms of my teaching, my philosophy is pretty much like to teach, to use research to inform my teaching, and pretty much integrating theory with practice, and by discussing real world case studies and integrating those with organized field visits. I also would like to promote problem solving skills by advancing interdisciplinary approaches, teaching sustainability challenges, and also the potential solutions. I also would like to promote critical thinking and self-reflection of the lessons learned by teaching the best available science, and also communicating what are the limitations and what are the strong points of that. And also advancing justice, equity, and diversity by treating everyone fairly and acknowledging different perspectives and from different people. So I'd like to thank my collaborators who have made this work successful through their support and friendship throughout the years. I'm also grateful to the different organizations that I've been able to work with, which have made this work successful. And I'm very grateful for your time and for listening. Thank you.
Okay, we're open for questions now. Look forward to hearing your thoughtful inquiry.
Yeah, okay, Rebecca, very interesting research, and it's impressive, very impressive to see the range of things you're covering. So on that part about scenarios, and you talked about the rich stories you got from the people, and you talked about these drivers being agricultural change, population growth, and climate change. But when you presented that 2x2 matrix, that had only agricultural growth and population. I was wondering about where climate change comes in, particularly because climate change is like the wild card. And I'm thinking about wild cards like that might emerge from stories that don't fit into those 2x2 matrices. We academics like to create these 2x2 matrices. But I'm wondering, when you talk to people, is it restricting to put those rich stories into those 2x2 that matrix 2x2? And where does climate change with all wild factors fit into that? For example, here, who would have imagined in October we are running into 3-digit temperatures, right? So where does all that fit in?
Yeah. All right, thanks, Jim. Yeah, so climate change is a big one, and especially because this area is a dry area, so and people depend on land, and so they suffer the most from climate change impacts. And so in those narratives, they definitely came with climate change, and there are scenarios which would have like better climate change adaptation measures compared to others. I just didn't include them there, but the narratives were like a page or two. But all the boxes sort of like address that. Like this one will have, climate change would affect all of them the same way. But this one would have like measures, this one will not have measures, this one would have measures, but they're not implemented. And then this one will probably be the best one, has measures that are implemented. And so all these narratives were there from the stakeholders. They certainly talked about that. And then also what we did, like in the modeling component, when I'm integrating the stakeholder narratives with the secondary data sources, I create like composite indicator layers. And so these are spatial layers, which pretty much are made up of a bunch of biophysical and social ecological variables. And some of the variables that are making these layers are like projected climate change. Like in the future, you have projected rainfall for this place, for the Kenya-Tanzania borderland region. And then you also have projected seasonality, rainfall seasonality. So they're included in the modeling. So they are captured in that way. And then also another way we were able to capture that is that when we had those maps developed, we then looked at the impacts of those on the sustainable development goals, which there's a goal, I think it's number 13, on climate action. So, and then looking at the targets for those goals. And so I think one of the targets that we actually worked on is climate change measures. And so looking at each of these scenarios, how will they be linked to the climate change adaptation measures identified by the SDGs? So that's how we kind of capture the climate change impacts.
Yeah, hi. So I'm curious about the relationship between the agent-based model and the participatory approach. So perhaps can you elaborate a little bit more how the participatory approach inform your ABM development, or in the other way around?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So for the agent-based modeling, that one I did actually, that work was for my PhD, and I didn't use participatory approach for that. So the participatory approach was for the scenarios. But the data that I collect for the agent-based model was like survey data. So the pastoralists that I talked about, and then I would talk to them, collected data on sort of like what are some of the land use priorities or decision-making process. And the idea was sort of like and also we went to the field. The idea was to sort of like use pattern-oriented modeling. So look at what is happening there and then come and write a code about that. And so from the insights that we got from the pastoralists that we talked to, those ones are the ones that I use in the agent-based modeling. Does that answer? Okay.
Hello? Okay. Thank you for your talk. I had a question about at what level of organization you think the interventions to really address this problem that we've seen for decades of, agriculture encroachment on conservation land. And so is this something that is tackled at the pastoralist level of their decision processes? Are the products that you produce in your research for their learning and then adjustment of their behaviors? Or do you think the solution and the levers are actually at a different level of organization? And how does your research kind of address where does the intervention need to happen? And maybe I imagine it's pretty complicated, but thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's a tough one. Only because the pastoralists can see the impact of agricultural encroachment. Number one, this is a dry area. So even if they do agriculture, I don't think they know it will not be sustainable. And so they tend to switch to agriculture when their livestock herds are dead and there's nothing to do and you depend on land and you have to eat and feed your family. So you do smallholder agriculture, get their food and that kind of thing. And so it's not something that they really want to do because it's also not their culture, but they have to because climate is changing, there's no other job to do. And then you also have on the other side, you have like the higher level where the government policies have been anti-pastoralism. And so they've pretty much been promoting agriculture. And because they see the sedentary lifestyle, like agriculture, as more controllable, as opposed to pastoralists who move from one place to the other and they can't claim land. And so you have all these government policies that don't favor the pastoralist on the other hand. And so I think, and then you also have NGOs coming in and trying to promote dryland agriculture. It's very confusing altogether. And so I think the level of intervention for that then would mean people have to work together. There's just no way to go around about it. Like work together at the local level where you have the pastoralists and also having these NGOs and investors coming in, investing in dryland agriculture. And then you have all these organizations and the government, the national government also favoring agriculture. So they have to work together because at the end of the day, it's whatever, agriculture is not sustainable in the area and you can't move elephants from Kilimanjaro to somewhere else, that's their home. And it's not working for them. So I think they have to work together, but in a genuine way. Like, I think in a genuine way and wanting to find that solution. Yeah.
Is it? There we go. So can you go back? So I'm going to come back to what you just answered. But first, can you go back to your slide that had the 4 quadrants in the park and the region? No, one that the map, yeah.
Which one?
The one that had the actual maps, your actual results from that showed with the one that was Rimjin was talking about where you had the 2, yeah, this one. When I'm just looking at this and I look at the one on the, top where we have high growth and high, it didn't look like it's that much worse. So am I just reading this wrong? I mean, is the worst case much, much worse than the best case?
I mean, sometimes it's difficult with these scenarios to say which one is good and which one is bad, only because it depends on whose perspective you're looking at. And so this one might look like a bad case for a conservationist only because you have protected areas being encroached because they don't want that.
Right.
But it might be good for someone who's interested in urbanization and development because the urban areas are growing.
Yeah, so good
Yeah.
answer. But it doesn't look that horrific even for the conservationist. I mean, yeah, you get some encroachment, but like you said, there's all these economic pressures, there's all this growth. Anyway, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't like just reading it wrong, because if they're not that different and you have very strong drivers in one direction, like economic growth, then that sounds like a really tough challenge, right? That starts to sound like the successes on the margins. So anyway, I just noticed that and I don't know what to make of that.
I think, yeah, it's not the biggest difference between like this one that has the most dramatic change and this one that doesn't have a lot of change. I think it's just the encroachment and the loss of natural beauty.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. If you jump ahead to the figure that you had where you showed the impact of the spending going into the different, where they had some spending for conservation versus agriculture. I think it was one of the 4 ones. Oh, well, don't worry about it. Anyway, this is a question sort of like of Hallie's question. So if spending on public lands to support conservation is really high impact, can your work help us get that up to the people who have money but are outside the system? Like I end up working with a lot of businesses and they want to do conservation that they can then get climate credits for and all that. They don't know how to do that. They have no knowledge of this. They're completely ignorant, right? So can this work of yours help to inform like these big global enterprises, for example, that want to put their money to play in a positive way for climate? Or is it like, no, it's, like you just answered, it's so complicated that if you just get some more money in there, it may or may not work?
No, I think it can work because they need that support, because you're telling people not to use their land for maybe farming or maybe like putting a big residential building, and you're telling them to use it for conservation only because elephants are also found in this area. And they're foregoing all the benefits that they would actually get if they use their land for agriculture. So I think they need to be compensated. I think it can work. And I think it needs to be shown to most people who are willing to fund such kinds of research, because it would be very helpful. One thing about these areas is that they really depend on tourism for them to grow and to continue. And so most of the people who fund this work are people maybe like from the global north. And so when you have instances like when COVID happened and people are not coming back to the south, and so most of these people, they have their land, they're not using it for initiatives that would bring in a lot of money, and they're allowing animals like the wildlife to use their land, but they're not getting anything from it. So they would benefit also at that level.
Thanks, Rebecca. So my question so I raised my hand before George finished his question. So now it's kind of starting to morph into George's. But my question has to do with, you set up this modeling approach, you're engaging in this participatory approach, and then you have clearly great spatial competence here, ability to show things, on the landscape. But I'm curious in your in that feedback loop of, modeling and then engagement with the community and then going back to your modeling, what have you learned about what kinds of outputs, what kinds of ways of conveying information, what particular kinds of statistics or indicators or ways of looking at futures have been, resonant or have worked more effectively than others with these communities, particularly because you have different kinds of communities here that have different interests. And as you said, may view the future very differently from a normative perspective.
Thanks, Josh. So I feel like when I look at the outputs that I get from this work, where I have the qualitative stories, those ones are really good for like academic audiences because they can be able to get the whole picture and look at the good scenarios, the bad scenarios, where the thoughts of the stakeholders who made these scenarios were from. So that's really good and it communicates to them. But for the pastoralists or people at the local level, they like seeing the maps because they understand that well. They can see, this is the river that I know. This is actually what's going to happen. And so those ones work well for them. And also other people who are not in academia, I think they appreciate the maps because they are able to tell this one works or this, they can be able to identify it well. But that being said and done, I think there is more room to improve such kinds of work by improving the robustness of how you can actually combine participatory approaches with like spatial modeling. It's something that is developing, and it's something that I'm really hoping to work with even researchers here at ASU in the sense that how can we develop robust methodologies that can be replicated from one place to the other and don't require a lot of like that knowledge that you really have to know, like not very specialized knowledge. It's something I would want to work with and just see how we could actually get all these methodologies out there where people can easily check them, get these outputs and use those outputs for decision making or maybe even monitoring. I think it would be very beneficial to do that.
My question was the same. Oh, sorry. My question was the same as the ones over here. So I'm really excited to see you using scenario planning because we have a class where we teach this. And I also think it's interesting to hear the question about climate change because in that class, I tell our students that that's a critical certainty, not an uncertainty. We know climate change is here and is happening. We don't know how much or exactly that way. But I ask for more specificity than just calling it climate change when we make our scenarios. So one question I have for you is what are some critical uncertainties and driving forces that are impacting your work right now? So thinking forward to future work that you'll be doing, what are you looking out for as you're developing new scenarios? And then number two, how can the resources here at ASU help you get these scenario planning documents into the hands of different people that might not be engaging with them yet or that it might not yet be reaching those audiences?
So in terms of the critical certainties that I'm working with, I think in the future, certainly there'll be more demand for land. And that will mean there'll be more conversion, we will need more towns. Urbanization has to happen. And this, the rate of growth of development doesn't really go well with conservation. So as development goes high, development goes down. And so that's something that has to be factored in. How are we going to ensure that there's balance between national development and also and national development and conservation? Other things that critical certainty. So another thing is there's the issue of mining. So these areas that I work with, there's a lot of mining inside. So like beneath some of these parks, we have gold and that kind of thing. No one is touching them now, but they've been identified. So these are things that are bound to happen. And so who decides what is more important in the future? And I mean, we're looking into the future, like some of these scenarios go until 2063, which is 40 years from now. That's a long time. People might decide elephants don't have value anymore. And so the gold and the copper and all these elements and minerals might be valued higher than the animals. We don't have the right value of also wildlife. So what's going to happen? I don't know, but that's something that will be discussed at some point. And then in terms of how I'm seeing ASU helping me with all this, yeah, that's a tricky one. So one, working with the people already working in scenario planning and sort of like amplifying some of these outputs and sharing them in different platforms. So I think that's one thing that I would benefit. And also like what I said, like just working with people, also working in scenario modeling and strengthening the methodology and making sure we can replicate it in other areas.
It follows on Jana's question, really. So I looked at your research interests for the future, research and teacher interests. Didn't say geographically where you want to be. I'm assuming it's in the same area of East Africa. And then that leads to my question, have you made inroads in United Nations Environment Program and eCraft that are right there in Nairobi? And if not, perhaps some of us can help you with that.
All right, yeah, thanks for that. So in terms of geographical location, I see myself continuing working in East Africa and Southern Africa where I've been working, but I also hope to expand to other geographical areas like here, but I'm more interested in the dry areas. And then in terms of meeting other people who are working in Nairobi, it would be nice to meet people at iCraft. So maybe I could talk to you about that more and just explore opportunities for that. Thanks.
Okay, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you, Rebecca. Great job. Thanks everyone for being here for your questions. There is food at the back, so hang around for a little bit to chat more about Rebecca's talk with Rebecca, with other people. And then we actually have another seminar again next week. So I know we've had 3 in a row, but then we have a month break. But we have EdChu next week here, and we'll be getting the abstract sent out shortly for that. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.